just go with it.
Right, we are back. We are back with the Coach Track podcast to talk about scaling and long-term success with myself, Greg Styan, and Dan Williams. Dan, really looking forward to this episode today. And I think a good place to start is a super strong opening question. 80% coaches quit or fail within inside 2 years, okay? We see lots of coaches come and go, particularly on X. What's the thoughts on that? Why do you think that happens?
I think one of the biggest reasons is because people are comparing themselves to other coaches. But what they don't realize is the only coaches that they're seeing are already in like the top 10, 20%. Because the bad ones, you're not even going to see them because they're not good at the marketing side. So they're comparing to these massive people who've been doing this for years and they get discouraged and they quit. And it's a shame because there's a lot of good coaches out there who just haven't got the marketing side right. But we're hoping to change that.
Absolutely. I've heard you say this a few times actually that lots of these people don't make it or don't have the sustainability. It's not that they're not good coaches, it's that they're not good marketers. Which also leads me to something else, survivorship bias. The only coaches we really get to see a lot of are the ones that have made it, are the ones that have been successful. Why do you think they've been so successful, some of these guys? What do you think enables some of these guys to keep on going past the 2 years to, 10, 15 years for some of these guys?
I think a lot of times it has to do with being open to advice. Like all the connections I've made on X have definitely made a massive difference to me in terms of the marketing. Because no one knows it all at the end of the day, and you can always learn more from people. So I think even you've done a lot of that with the connections of X on LinkedIn as well, and it's been good to see.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a really good answer. I think one of the main reasons that coaches last compared to some of the ones that don't is they're prepared to change. Is that they're prepared to evaluate them, not just themselves, but relook at their niche, relook at the trends. I was talking to you just before we come on, and I was saying that, Tony Robbins started off with cassette tapes and now he does big talks and, big auditoriums and stadiums, etc. James Smith started off as a PT, and it seems to be like his approach now is business, if you like. Do you recommend that coaches try and keep their approach open and that they try and be dynamic, or do you think that they should try and center in? Most of the people we work are new coaches, aren't they, or guys trying to refine their offer? What sort of advice would you give for someone like that?
You definitely got to start somewhere. You've got to have your set offer, which people associate you with, but that can change over time, like over a period of months or years. But you can't just say, "Oh, I'm a generalist. I know all this stuff," because you don't, and you're not going to build trust that way. You've got to start with what you know, and then as your journey progresses, people are going to watch that, and they're going to start trusting you more, and then you can start pivoting to other things. Like for me, I started with drop shipping, which is something I don't talk about a lot. When I was like 14, 15, and it was an absolute failure. I didn't make a single pound, but I did learn quite a lot of marketing skills from that. And yeah, it's all part of the process, isn't it? Like you shouldn't be afraid to pivot and try things that are new that you enjoy. It's all part of the process.
Absolutely. That's such a great answer. And I think that's so right to say that you learn from your mistakes. How many of these businessmen that we see, the really successful ones, famous when they're 40 or 40 plus, and you think that, this might be their third, fourth, fifth business. If they hadn't have had those experiences before, those struggles, the ups and downs, learning the in and outs of business, then they wouldn't have been able to be so successful. It's really interesting to talk about drop shipping. I tried, PT training, nutrition, all these sort of like part-time roles, all these side hustles, give me the opportunity to learn, give me the opportunity to hone some of my skills. But then I could lean into the coach that I am now, if that makes sense. I think a really good place to be moving on now, Dan, isn't it? Is any tips, any tricks for longevity and success, especially with maybe writing on X or LinkedIn? Any hacks that you would recommend?
I think the biggest thing I've seen with, the patterns that have been I've noticed in people that have been on X the longest are being themselves, authenticity, which is something we talk about a lot. Because obviously it's not sustainable to try and be a whole different person for like a solid an hour, 2 hours a day sustainably. And it's just not going to work. And even if you do manage that, which you can't, you're not going to get on with the clients that you attract. So that's definitely a big thing. Um, and it's something that we've done quite a lot of as well. And we've stood out because of it.
That's a really good answer. I always remember the guy that you spoke about that said he spends 5 hours a day marketing. 5 hours a day. If you think about that over 3 weeks, a month, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, that is unsustainable. That is my biggest tip for any new coaches is to think about the amount of time that you spend on marketing that you can keep sustainable. That's why we developed the tick box formula, where 1 hour a day or 90 minutes every other day, and you're strict on yourself. And that's one thing that we've seen, Dan, isn't it? When we work with these coaches, especially the new ones that come in and they're overwhelmed, or they start with us and then they realize just how hard it is to keep this going over a sustained amount of time, you know? So maybe let's talk a little bit more about our tick box formula. Let's talk a little bit more about yours, Dan. What does your routine look like?
For me, I try and keep it quite relaxed. I just go for about 20 to 30 minutes a day of engagement on my account, just commenting on ideally newer people. So you're getting those more connections and it's not staying stagnant. So it keeps you on your toes as well with seeing all the new content. And also DMs are a big thing. I think I procrastinated on them for a long time, like a good few months. But once I started sending them, I started seeing instant results. Like the DMs are where the connections are made. The content is just kind of the funnel for that. So I think people need to be more mindful of who they're connecting with as well, because who you, the content you consume is going to influence the content you create. So it's quite interesting to see.
That's a really good answer. So for me, with the tick box formula, where I shifted from being a part-time coach to a full-time coach, I made some real shifts. I made some real changes, not just to my approach, but most importantly to my schedule. I leave Mondays completely open. That is my day for discovery calls. I make sure that I take off one day a week, preferably a Friday or a Saturday, and I leave Sunday to podcasts. Okay. I learned that from something called the Eisenhower Matrix, where you look at what is the most important aspect of your week and you put that in first. Mondays for discovery calls, Sundays for podcasts, one day off. The other way I tried to make my timetable sustainable was implementing the tick box formula and being really specific over what I do in those time periods to get maximum effect. So I'd start off with DMs first, and then cold DMs, and then content making. 20, 20, 20. With a 1 hour podcast or a 1 hour SoundCloud mix, which enables me to dial in. And then the first aspect that I go at is 20 minutes of DMs. X, LinkedIn, Instagram, doesn't matter. 40, 50, 60. If I don't get them finished in 20 minutes, I move on and I come to them the next day. I'm really strict. So I can stopwatch there, I follow it, I lock in, and I go for it. Almost like it's competing, almost like it's a cycle, which you do, Dan, isn't it? And then the next stage that I go for is the cold DM, where I look who's liked, who's commented, and then I reach out to them and I try and build those connections. And then the next thing is 20 minutes of content creation. If I don't get it finished, it's not the end of the world. I come back to it. I can make 6 videos in 30 minutes. I can make 3 reels and edit them in 15. If I don't finish it, I come back to it. And that's how I learn how to be strict on myself for long-term longevity. If I hadn't have had that moment where I treat it like a job, where I changed my mindset from coach to CEO, then I wouldn't have had those golden moments. What do you think about that, Dan? Can you relate to that? Have you heard anything similar?
Yeah, the Eisenhower matrix is something new to me. That sounds quite interesting. I kind of structure my days, so I book calls from the end of the day to the start of the day. So I keep the first like 3, 4, 5 hours just completely free. So I've got all that content creation time because obviously that's my job. So whatever your job is, you should spend, in my opinion, the first few hours of the day just going all in on that, all in on the client work, the stuff that's actually going to make you money. And then in the afternoon, I go more on the looser side, just um, replying to DMs or taking calls, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, maybe I should start structuring my week like that as well, not just my day.
Okay, Dan, that would really help you. I can talk to you about structuring your week using Maslow's hierarchy of needs, using the Eisenhower matrix. Basically, how I started with this is it turns to me not just practicing what I preach, but doing it myself and implementing that in my everyday life. The first thing you do with the Eisenhower matrix is you look at every single activity that you do over a week. So for me, that's spending time with my wife, that's the football team that I run, coaching, cold outreach, sessions with you, podcasts, etc., etc. You realize before that you've maybe got 10, 20, 30 things that you do. Then what you need to do is to list them in matter of importance. And the number ones you pop in first. So for me, that's my football team. Actually, I'll change that. Number one is my wife. She goes first. Number two is my football team. Number three is the podcast and the discovery calls. Number four are my everyday sessions. And that's how I structure it. And that's how I go about my day. I also am very strict on myself on what time I wake up, what time I go to sleep. I'm up at 6 o'clock in the morning. I walk my dog. I work out. I am dialed in at 7:30 at least 6 days a week to do my 1 hour tick box formula. Even Christmas Day, Boxing Day, doesn't matter. That's how I learned the secret to longevity is to be strict on yourself and to schedule posts, to plan ahead. And that's the real trick. And I think that's why many coaches come and go. I think many come into the game and they realize, wow, this is a massive challenge, and they get completely overwhelmed. Do you think that's the same, Dan, for marketers and not just coaches and everyone who works online? What are your thoughts about that?
I think that's a lot of useful information that a lot of people would benefit from there. I know you mentioned before as well, learning as you go. I think that's quite interesting because no one's going to have a completely optimized routine instantly. Like you're going to have to start somewhere, and that's what a lot of people we've seen are afraid to do. They just don't want to start. They want to keep it. They want to start. If they want to start, it has to be optimized, but it's not going to be optimized. They've got to understand that, and it's different for everyone, isn't it? I think slightly. So you've got to see what works for you really, and go with that.
Absolutely. Approach. It is different for everyone. I think that's absolutely perfect in the situation we're in. When I got into coaching, like I said, 10 years ago, I know this is one of the big questions that you wanted to ask me. I started off with the real basics: PT work, nutrition, life coaching, for example. Like most coaches go in with a generic approach, but then you realize that sometimes your niche finds you. When I really started and I went full time, I was a generic life coach. You realize it's such a saturated market and you're competing with Tony Robbins, people like that. But that's when that I realized there's other aspects of coaching, like relationship coaching, like career coaching, like mentoring other coaches, like we do that. If I haven't have had those experiences, if I've had those knocks and those falls, then those niches wouldn't have found me. I was flexible. And that's one of the biggest advices, Dan, isn't it? When we mentor other people, is be prepared to take on advice. If I hadn't have had that moment where I took on advice from you, Dan, and others, then I wouldn't have been able to turn it from a part-time job to a full-time job. And it's interesting that I called it a job as well. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's different. Like I think a lot of people are overthinking. Like we've seen it a lot with our clients. They're just overthinking. They need to just start somewhere and go from there. I think I started as well on X as a Facebook ads guy, which is obviously is quite old fashioned now. But back in the day, when Facebook ads were a good thing, I was marketing Facebook ads on X, which is quite weird to think about, but that's what I was doing. And I realized that I was getting more interest from the X side than the Facebook ad side. So I saw that something I was doing was working better than the main thing that I was trying to market, and I pivoted. And if I hadn't have done that, I would probably have been, I don't know, not in the position that I'm in now. So you've got to see what works and go from there. That's my opinion.
Absolutely, Dan. It's such a good story. I think one thing that we can agree on is analysis paralysis. We see this a lot with coaches, don't it? We see this a lot with coaches, analysis paralysis, where they're overwhelmed with the market, overwhelmed with the possible opportunities, and there's too much going on. That's why taking advice and delegation is one of the greatest tips that I can give in coaching this market is be prepared to take advice, listen to what other people say, and to look at yourself from the outside in. And I think, Dan, this is one of the biggest issues that we see, isn't it? Especially on X, is lots of these people, they come in and they're like everyone else, and they realize this is difficult, it is saturated, the competition is high. And that also then goes back, doesn't it, to survivorship bias, why some of them survive, why you see Tony Robbins doing this for 20 years or whatever he's done, even longer, because he's adapted and he's changed. Dan, I think a good way to finish up with this is if you're a new coach and you're coming into this business, what would be your best advices for maybe planning ahead, for maybe setting small goals? But would you start big? Would you start small? What's your take homes for any new coaches listening to this?
I think by now the listeners will realize that there aren't any shortcuts. You're going to have to turn up. You're going to have to be yourself, and you're going to have to see where it takes you, really, because the market's constantly changing. Your interests are probably constantly changing. So you can't really plan exactly ahead for, 10 years in the future because things are going to be quite different. So all you've got to do is do what works now and keep analyzing as well, which is something we talk about a lot. Um, and see what's working the best and just go with that. And you're going to see exponential growth from that. That would be my biggest advice.
Absolutely. That's such a good answer. I think a good way to finish this podcast is to talk about a few stats that would really help people. I was reading this week that coaching, they predict, is going to go up by 2 billion every single year. We also know that there are at least 50,000 new ICF coaches that come into the business every year. We also know that 80 to 86% of them fail or quit within their first 2 years. So, a real difference between being the 10% for the ones that make it is to plan ahead, be prepared to take advice, delegate, but also consistency. Consistency. I think that's the real take homes from me, Dan, with becoming the 10%, isn't it, with the people that we mentor. Anything else you want to say, Dan, before we leave for today? Any other final tips for longevity?
I think you said 2 billion in coaching. I think 1.5 billion of that is probably going to be from the top 1% or top 0.1% of coaches. And what they're doing differently is they're being themselves, which is a massive thing. And they're also kind of making it sustainable into the future because they don't want to burn out. They don't want to, stop enjoying the coaching. So that's a massive thing. Just enjoy it and make sure it's all sustainable and just turn up, find what works for you. And you're not gonna know that now. You're only gonna know that with experience, unfortunately. And that's the harsh truth from us, I think, yeah.
Absolutely, Dan. The harsh truth of coaching, not as easy as you think it would be. And that's why so many fail. And the ones that survive aren't just good coaches, they're good marketers. And that's what we're about in the coach trap, isn't it? Is changing your mindset from a coach to the CEO of your own business. And I think that that's what this is all about. Dan, thanks very much for your time. Hope you enjoy your cycling. And let's speak again next week.
Absolutely. I've learned a lot from that. I'm gonna save quite a bit of time now. So thanks, Greg.